In this video, we will discuss the Progressive Era, an era of intense social and political reform aimed at making progress toward a better society. Reformers in this era sought to use the power of the federal government to eliminate unfair business practices, reduce corruption, and correct the problems created by industrialization. During the Progressive Era, protections for workers and consumers were strengthened, and women won the right to vote. What is progressivism? Many historians define it as the urban counterpart to the rural populism, the beginnings of modern liberalism. Progressives believe that the government should be more active in the lives of its citizens. Social problems should be addressed through government legislation, and that public funds should be used to fix those issues. Who were the progressives? They were a very diverse group of young, middle-class, well-educated, native-born Americans. They were church leaders, union leaders, blacks, feminists, Protestants, Republicans, Democrats, urban professionals, academicians, teachers, journalists, doctors, lawyers, small businessmen, social workers, political reformers, and farmers. The progressives targeted major problems caused by the growth of industry and the growth of cities during the Gilded Age. One of the biggest problems they wanted to fix was caused by big business, including monopolies, banks, harmful trusts, and the railroads. They all contributed to poor working conditions as well as the concentration of wealth. Urbanization had created numerous problems, including child labor, declining morals, poor living conditions, and political corruption. Progressives also saw the need for consumer protection, environmental protection, and preventing the spread of socialism and anarchy. To achieve this, progressives advocated social, economic, and political change. Progressives saw danger in the rising power of business, labor violence, concentration of wealth, political machines, unrest of the poor, moral decay, racism, and discrimination. They wanted to build on the existing society and improve the equality of life. They wanted to take government away from the special interest groups and put it back in the hands of the people. They also wanted to end the abuse of power and social injustice, and regulate business and expand democracy. Muckrakers were Progressive-era journalists that sought to expose the corruption in big business and government. The work of muckrakers influenced the passage of key legislation that strengthened protections for workers and consumers. Upton Sinclair was one of the most famous muckrakers of the period, especially for his novel The Jungle. The Jungle was a fictionalized account of the corruption and contamination in Chicago's meatpacking industry. It raised public awareness of the exploitation and foul conditions to which workers in the meatpacking industry were subjected. It led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Some of the most famous progressive muckrakers were women. Ida Tarbell, a teacher, author, and journalist, published a series of articles in McClure's magazine in 1902. These articles became the foundation for her book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which was published in 1904 and depicted Standard Oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller as a greedy, miserly monopolist. The book quickly became a bestseller and established Tarbell as an early pioneer of investigative journalism. Muckrakers also sought to raise awareness of poverty and other social ills associated with industrialization. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant and photojournalist, published an 18-page photo essay called How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York, which appeared first in the February 1889 issue of Scribner's magazine, and the following year was published as a book. The photos documented the harsh living conditions of recent immigrants in New York City and inspired such reforms as the New York Tenement House Act of 1901, which required tenement housing to be cleaner, safer, and more spacious. Other muckrakers include John Spargo, English author, who wrote The Bitter Cry of Children, one of the most influential and widely read accounts of child labor. He described work at the coal breaker, an area outside a mine where coal was sorted and organized by young children. Frank Norris, a writer best known for his books The Octopus and the Pit, which emphasized the power of railroad monopolies over California ranchers. Ida B. Wells, an African-American journalist and suffragist, was another influential female muckraker. She had been born into slavery in Mississippi in 1862, and in the 1890s became involved in anti-lynching activism. In 1892, she published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, which detailed the systematic disenfranchisement of Southern blacks and even some poor whites. Wells was very influential in the early movement for civil rights, and was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. Ray Stannard Baker wrote his influential novel Following the Color Line in 1908. This book examines America's racial divide during the Progressive Era. Lewis Hine, photographer, was best known for his documentary photography of child labor during the early 20th century. An important challenge to the laissez-faire and social Darwinist attitudes of the Gilded Age was the social gospel movement. It was a religious movement led by Protestant ministers, who began to tie salvation and good works together. They argued that people must put aside their own earthly desires and help the needy. They believed that the purpose of wealth was not to hoard it, but to share it with the less fortunate. Followers of the social gospel movement implemented numerous reforms to help other people. One of their biggest contributions is the creation of settlement houses. Settlement houses provide access to education, free or low-cost health care, free or low-cost housing, and many other benefits. One of the biggest proponents was Walter Rauschenbusch, who wrote Christianity and the Social Crisis in 1907. Rauschenbusch and other ministers also pushed for labor reforms that were eventually realized during the New Deal of the 1930s. Settlement houses originally began in the 1880s in London in response to problems created by urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. The idea spread to the United States at the end of the 19th century. Settlement houses typically attracted educated, native-born, middle-class, and upper-middle-class women and men, known as residents, to live in poor urban neighborhoods. By 1900, the U.S. had over 100 settlement houses. By 1911, Chicago had 35. In the 1890s, Hull House was located in the midst of a densely populated urban neighborhood, peopled by Italian, Irish, German, Greek, Bohemian, and Russian and Polish Jewish immigrants. During the 1920s, African Americans and Mexicans began to put down roots in the neighborhood and joined the clubs and activities at Hull House. Jane Addams and the Hull House residents provided kindergarten and daycare facilities for the children of working mothers, an unemployment bureau, an art gallery, libraries, English and citizenship classes, and theater, music, and art classes. As the complex expanded to include 13 buildings, Hull House supported more clubs and activities such as the Labor Museum, the Jane Club for single working girls, meeting places for trade union groups, and a wide array of cultural events. The main women in charge of the suffrage movement were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Anthony and Stanton created the women's suffrage group NWSA, of the National Women's Suffrage Association. This group urged for the women's right to vote, and even urged for equal pay, fair employment, and easier divorces. The American Women's Suffrage Association, or AWSA, was a group founded by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe in the Boston area. This group wanted to focus on changing laws state by state instead of changing the Constitution. However, this group was not as popular as the NWSA, so the leaders of the group thought if they combined with the NWSA, they would be able to make a better impact. So together they created the group NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association. This became the largest women's suffrage group in the nation. Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado were the first three states that adopted women's suffrage in 1893 and 1896. Idaho also recognized the women's right to vote. After these recognitions, women started to look at different ways to catch attention. A woman named Alice Paul, a Quaker activist, formed a new party called the National Women's Party. With this group, she was determined to win an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would grant suffrage rights to women without the need for struggling state by state. The group wanted to stand out even more, so they started to picket in front of the White House. By 1916, almost all of the major suffrage organizations were united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment. When New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917, and President Wilson changed his position to support an amendment in 1918, the political balance began to shift. On May 21, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later the Senate followed. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920, the amendment passed its final hurdle of obtaining the agreement of 3/4 of the states. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the ratification on August 26, 1920, changing the face of American electorate forever. The campaign for women's suffrage was long, difficult, and sometimes dramatic, yet ratification did not ensure full enfranchisement. Decades of struggle to include African Americans and other minority women in the promise of voting rights remained. Many women remained unable to vote long into the 20th century because of discriminatory state voting laws. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Progressive-era civil rights activist and author that challenged existing racial norms. He was the first African American to earn a Ph.D. and wrote a collection of essays that became his work known as The Souls of Black Folk. In it, he articulates his experiences and discusses the major problems of American society. He gains his fame with the founding of the Niagara Movement, a group of African American activists that pushed for equal rights for blacks. Du Bois and the Niagara Movement opposed Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, that blacks should accept segregation and discrimination until they can receive basic educational and economic opportunities. Du Bois strongly protested against lynching, the Jim Crow laws, and discrimination in education and employment. In 1905, he and several others founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Its purpose was to seek justice for African Americans and end segregation and discrimination. Most of its work happened in the courtroom, or used lawsuits to fight the battle against discrimination. Two examples of this happened in the Progressive era. In Ginn versus the United States, the Supreme Court struck down the grandfather clause in Oklahoma's Voter Registration Act because it discriminated against blacks and violated the 15th Amendment. In Buchanan versus Warley, the Supreme Court struck down a Kentucky law that prohibited blacks from living on a block where the majority of residents were white. It cited the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment as protection of civil rights enjoyed by all Americans. The oldest system of city government in the U.S. was the mayor-council system, which divides power between an elected mayor and the city council. The elected mayor appoints the heads of each department, while the city council enacts laws that are to be carried out by those city departments. Rampant corruption in many cities during the Gilded Age prompted reformers to come up with ways to run cities efficiently without political machines and widespread corruption. Progressive reformers came up with two new systems of city government aimed at solving those major issues. The first was called the commission system. Under this form of government, voters elected commissioners, who served as the department heads of the major segments of the city government, fire, police, etc. Under this system, if a department head is ineffective or corrupt, they answer to the people and will not be re-elected. The other form of city government created during the Progressive era was the city manager or council manager system. Under this system, voters elect the city council, which appoints both a city manager and department heads of the major city departments. The city manager oversees the department heads, who must follow the laws passed by the city council. The city manager is not a politician, but a person who is trained to manage large numbers of people and is accountable to the city council, who in turn must answer to the people. Under pressure by progressive reformers, states began to pass reforms to expand direct democracy and put power back in the hands of the people. One such reform is known as the initiative. An initiative is a process in 19 states by which citizens can bypass state legislatures to place proposed statutes or constitutional amendments directly on the ballot for voter approval. The second major reform is known as referendum. A popular referendum is a process in 23 states by which citizens can place a measure on the ballot that will repeal specific statutes that the legislature passed. The popular referendum is alternatively called the veto referendum, citizen referendum, statute referendum, or statute remand. The legislative referendum is a process where the state legislature places a proposed statute or constitutional amendment on the ballot for voters to approve. In many states, legislators are required to ask the voters for approval on issues including constitutional amendments and bond measures. U.S. residents were becoming more and more concerned about corruption within the political process in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One reform instituted by progressives in many states was the direct primary. Until the advent of the direct primary, political parties usually chose their candidates in closed-door meetings or at political conventions. As a result of this process, a few influential people were often able to manipulate the party's choice of candidates. Progressives believe that this process led to political corruption and kept elections from being truly democratic. With a direct primary system, the voters choose for themselves who would represent their political party in regular election. Wisconsin was the first state to implement the direct primary, and other states soon followed its example. The recall is a process in 20 states that allows citizens to remove elected officials from office before that official's term has expired. In most recall states, citizens need not provide any specific ground for recalling the official, and the question of whether to remove the official from office is placed on the ballot for voters to decide. If voters approve the ballot measure to recall the official, an election is held to replace that official. Some progressive reforms came as a result of tragedy. The Triangle Factory was located in the top three floors of the APUSH building in New York City. It was a true sweatshop, employing young immigrant women who worked in a cramped space at lines of sewing machines. Nearly all the workers were teenage girls who did not speak English and worked 12 hours a day every day. There was only one fully operational elevator, and the workers had to file a long, narrow hallway to get to it. There were also two stairways, but one was locked from the outside to prevent theft, and the other only opened inward. It did have a fire escape, but it was so narrow it was basically useless. There was also no sprinkler system installed, although the technology did exist. On March 25th, a Saturday afternoon, there were 600 workers at the factory when a fire began in a rag bin. The manager attempted to use the fire hose to extinguish it, but it was unsuccessful, and the hose was rotted and the valve was rusted shut. As the fire grew, panic ensued. The young workers tried to exit the building by the elevator, but it could only hold 12 people at a time, and the operator was able to make just 4 trips back and forth before it broke down. In a desperate attempt to escape the fire, the girls left behind, waiting for the elevator, plunged down the shaft to their deaths. The girls who fled via the stairwells also met awful demises when they found a locked door at the bottom of the stairs. Many were burned alive. Within 18 minutes, it was all over. 49 workers had burned to death or had been suffocated by smoke, 36 were dead in the elevator shaft, and 58 died from jumping to the sidewalks. With 2 more dying later from their injuries, a total of 145 people were killed by the fire. The fire helped unite organized labor, which set up a march to protest the conditions that led to the fire. The fire pushed the city to enact reforms to prevent this from happening again.